Good evening, everybody, and I hope we are right now. Last class we had gone through the some of the ECG changes by Dr. Devapoto. Today, Dr. Oyon Kaur, he is our consultant cardiologist, interventional cardiologist at NH Tagore Hospital, and he is a very bright cardiologist, relatively young but very bright, as well as I think he is one of the most learned in this particular field. He will cover this acute coronary syndrome, and as you all know that this acute coronary syndrome is one of the major area where there may be so many questions that may be asked in both theory as well as during your practice also, clinical practice you should know, because unless you have some basically acute coronary syndrome is an emergency situation, you should have good idea about the coronary, how to approach. And there are actually every time there are some changes happening every say 3 months to 6 months, so that is also important, what are the changes that is happening and new innovations that is happening in this particular field. So Dr. Oyonkar, without wasting time, I will request Dr. Oyonkar to take the dais and to start the session. And if you have any, again, I am telling those who I think most are old, those who are new, they can put their questions on the right side. Chat box is there, and in the chat box you can put your questions, whatever you. Even if you don't understand, you can immediately ask, or you can request for the further discussion for that particular field or particular area. Okay. So with this, Dr. Ayan, please.
Uh, Thank you, sir, for those very encouraging words. And so let me get to the presentation directly. Good evening, everybody. It's a wonderful forum, and it is good to be back to medicine again. So as I always feel that acute coronary syndromes is not something that is to be managed by cardiologists alone. So the spirit of this talk is actually to ensure that all physicians are aware of how acute coronary syndromes are, and I do not want to treat acute coronary syndromes with the very parochial eyes of a cardiologist alone, because the beauty of being a physician is in an is the ability to actually do a wholesome assessment of the patient. So I will give you a broad overlay of my talk. We will talk about the broad presentation of ACS patients. I will not go too much into depth of pathophysiology because that is, I think, something that is over and again talked about in books, and your Harrison is there to talk about it. I will talk about the ischemia cascade. I will talk about management strategies, and I hope you take back home at the end of the talk certain important facets as to how to manage acute coronary syndromes in the current scenario. So let me broadly put it this way. When we talk about acute coronary syndrome, we talk about a broad spectrum of diseases that involves ST elevation MI, non-ST elevation MI, and unstable angina. So as far as coronary syndromes are concerned, we are talking about a blocked coronary. So it is basically a spectrum of disorders which is arising out of a consequence of reduced coronary blood flow to the heart. So at this juncture, I would like to emphasize on the fact that the diagnosis of acute coronary syndrome is actually a clinical one. It is not really made on the basis of biomarkers. So in order to label a patient as a STEMI, you need to basically have evidences, clinical evidences of chest pain, of EKG elevations, and corroborating evidence which makes that patient capable of therapy, which is given in a patient of STEMI. So remember, in order to deliver therapy, in this case, which is a primary angioplasty, you really do not need lab investigations. You do not need a cardiac biomarker. You do not actually need an echocardiogram. All you need is actually a good clinical history and an EKG to decide on therapy. So, to give you some perspective to my talk, so in the last few decades, India has made it to Mars. We have the GSLV rocket, which puts very expensive satellites into space. We have an own homegrown aircraft. Generic market brands of India is available all over the world, and we are basically the manufacturing hub as far as generics are concerned. We also have the Indian GPS in place. But despite all these achievements, remember that one of the largest causes of death in India is actually cardiovascular diseases. So if you look in this was published in 2012, and if you look at this data, it basically tells you that cardiovascular diseases contributes to almost 1.8 to 2 million deaths per year, and that is a huge amount of deaths. If you look at the current COVID data, actually till today morning, I think it was somewhere around zero point 0.7 million. But remember, cardiovascular diseases on a regular basis in India causes about 1.8 to 2 million deaths per year, which is huge. And if you look at the same data over the last decade from 2000 to 2010 in the Western data, this is mostly from Americas, so you can see there is a declining trend in total cardiovascular deaths. But that is not the case in India. So around the same time in India, you will see that the total cardiovascular deaths, the prevalence of IHD as well as stroke has actually gone up and not really reduced. And remember, this is despite the fact that we have one of the youngest populations in the world with a median age of 25 years only. So we have the spectrum of coronary artery disease that we see in India, or rather the reason why all of us need to be so alert and aware about coronary artery disease is because it has very dangerous features which is not seen elsewhere. So it has number one very high mortality rates because of late presentations, because of financial issues, because of inavailability of health structures. We have very high premature mortality. So remember, of the 182,000 deaths that happened, 593,000 actually were less than 60 years, according to the Million Death Study. And you remember this actually is a huge burden on the population in the form of economic burden. So you have medicines, you have heart failure, you have readmissions, etc., which can be prevented if therapy was given in time. And of course, remember, this is not something that is restricted only to the urban population of India. Now it is actually creeping into the rural population also. So remember, coronary artery disease affects Indians almost a decade earlier than Caucasians. So we are actually much prone to have much more severe disease much more early because we are Indian per se. So, what is the presentation of STEMI like? So, let me bring to a certain amount of history here. So, if you remember, the first this history of a fatal chest pain was described by a Chicago internist by the name of James P. Herrick from Rush Medical College, and he actually showed an autopsy finding in a certain patient who presented with acute angina. And typically, this was not any angina; it was actually a left main occlusion, and this patient died. At that point of time, people did not have an idea as to what a left main occlusion actually had implications like, but this is what he actually found. But it actually hasn't been explicitly put into guidelines for much, much later. So you will find that the first guidelines on STEMI have actually come almost 50 to 60 years later. And then if you look at the first common symptom of MI, that is an angina, and you will find so varied descriptions depending on whether it goes to the shoulder, radiates to the left arm, it comes as a chest compression, it comes as epigastric discomfort, which is very commonly seen in inferior wall MIs, and then radiating to the jaw. So of these, one of the most important ones that you need to remember is radiating to the jaw, and this is generally suggestive of proximal LAD or left main occlusions, which have the highest mortality. So if you look at William Heberdine, who first described angina in his great dialogue that is known as the disorder of the breast, he actually says that the very feat of it and the sense of strangling and anxiety with which it attended may make it not improperly be called angina pectoris, and that is how you get the name of angina pectoris. So now comes to the very fact that does angina, is it the tell all of all MI? So can you really depend on chest pain as a diagnostic for acute coronary syndrome? So you look at this was a huge Medline search that was done, and this was because the American physician community, this is from the JAMA, that is the Journal of the American Medical Association, they found that despite diagnostic advances, this is in 2005, so they were unable to diagnose ACS in about 10% of patients, which is quite significant. And so this was adding to an extended $8 billion in annual costs. So they wanted to see whether actually angina itself, or its classification, or its quality, or its severity, would it actually be able to diagnose MI? So as you can see from the conclusion, as I've pointed out in yellow, that although certain elements of chest pain history are associated with increased or decreased likelihoods of diagnosis of ACS, none of them alone or in combination identify a group of patients that can be safely discharged without further diagnostic testing. So most of these patients, depending on the clinical criteria, and if you have a high suspicion for a cardiac problem, do not send these patients home without further testing. So if you look at so they looked at various types of pain descriptors like radiation to the right arm, shoulders, on exertion, left arm, diaphoresis, nausea, vomiting, or with previous angina, or described just as pressure. So you will see the most common description was the pressure, that is the discomfort that Heberdine initially discovered. But as you will see, the likelihood ratio is very low. So something that has a likelihood ratio above 10 is actually rules in disease. But having a likelihood ratio anything between 1 and 4.7 actually is not always diagnostic. So all I intend to tell you is that do not go just by the angina quality and description. Do look into these patients in a more wholesome manner. So next, we need to understand that most of these patients, when they actually come to us, that is with ECG changes, they are already about 80% into a full-fledged myocardial infarction. So remember, once there is an alteration of blood supply to the heart, you have first metabolic alterations at the cellular level. That results in a perfusion abnormality in the cardiac myocyte. Then next thing that happens is diastolic dysfunction, which means an inability of the heart to relax well. And then of course it comes in the systolic dysfunction, which is often seen on an echocardiogram, and we often label it as a regional wall motion abnormality. Finally, we come up with ECG changes. So remember, by the time we actually see this patient in the emergency, he is already in a florid state of an acute heart attack. And of course, after that, we have an angina. So this is something that you need to remember. So these patients who are actually coming to you with a ST elevation MI, these patients are already have their heart coronary artery blocked for quite some time before they actually present to the emergency and that you start treatment. So which is why time is of the essence. So here time is going to be equal to muscle. And since this forum is mostly based for physicians, I would always tell you that do not be parochial like the cardiologists. You need to understand that not all myocardial infarctions are because of coronary artery occlusion. So you need to have a quick lookout for small other correctable causes also, like anemia. You could have a ventricular tachycardia, you could have heart failure, you could have kidney disease, you could have hypotension, you could have hypoxemia. So remember, this in various combinations can also give a clinical picture which is consistent with a myocardial injury, but not necessarily a myocardial infarction. And this is something that you will get only by a good history and a good clinical examination. So we'll come to the fourth universal definition of myocardial infarction, and this was published in 2018. So if you see till before 2000, the definition of a myocardial infarction was purely based on ECG criteria that was first developed after Einthoven actually developed the ECG machine, for which he actually got a Nobel Prize. And if you look at it, this was basically an epidemiological criteria and it was not based on any other diagnostic tests. And as I told you, for actually ECG criteria to set in, you're already late into the disease, which is why after cardiac troponins were actually discovered, they were incorporated into the approach. And after 2000, as you see, we have the universal definition, then the third universal definition, and finally the fourth universal definition of MI, which as of now incorporates cardiac biomarkers whenever you make a diagnosis of myocardial infarction. So how does this work? So we have studies which tell you that once you do a cardiac troponin, and if the value is on the 99th percentile of the upper reference limit, we basically decide whether there is a rise or fall of the troponin. So if it is rise and fall, and if with a history which is consistent with acute ischemia, we make a diagnosis of acute myocardial infarction. And then of course we have this place where we are talking about so this could be because either of atherosclerosis and thrombosis, which is going to be the large part of discussion of today's talk. And of course, remember, as physicians, you always have to remember that It can also happen because of an oxygen supply and demand imbalance, and that is something that happens because of this is something referred to as a type 2 MI and not a type 1 MI. So, an atherosclerosis thrombosis is considered as a type 1 MI. So, overall, if you look at the universal classification of myocardial infarction, there are five types of MI. Number one, type 1 MI is because of atherosclerosis and thrombosis. Number two is because of supply demand mismatch, which could be because of anemia, because of hypoxemia, or because of other metabolic disorders, or because of rhythm disorders. Type 3 is basically those patients of myocardial infarction, suspected myocardial infarction, who present with sudden cardiac death. Type 4 has basically procedure related, and that is mostly with PTCA related, and type 5 is mostly post bypass related. So even after these two procedures, you could have elevation in cardiac troponins, and that is how they get incorporated into the universal definition of MI. So remember, even without acute ischemia, you could still have an acute myocardial injury, and that could be in the form of a pericarditis, a myocarditis, or a myopericarditis, mostly viral, or in acute heart failure. Sometimes you have troponin release. So remember, troponins are released by the heart in the form of stress. So that is when exactly it comes out into the system, and it basically is assayed in various kind of assays, and it tells you whether the heart is under a lot of duress or not. Remember, you can also have certain situations where you have a stable troponin level rise, and that is mostly seen in chronic myocardial injuries. And this is mostly those kind of patients who have structural heart disease, that could be in the form of myocarditis, or it could be valvular lesions, or it could be chronic kidney disease also. So these are patients, remember, which is why in chronic kidney disease patients, sometimes troponins are not a good marker to look for as acute coronary syndrome. So patients where in chronic kidney disease where you're suspecting acute coronary syndrome, you may not always be able to make your diagnosis purely on cardiac biomarkers. You might have to look into the EKG, you might have to look in for new regional wall motion abnormalities or other imaging evidences which make a diagnosis of acute coronary syndrome. So, which is why we are talking about troponins. So, remember, troponins in the cardiac, in the heart, is present in two forms. It is present in the free form in the cytoplasm, which is the earliest rise of troponin that you get once there is leakage of these proteins and when the heart is in duress. And the other one is the one which is basically seen within the cardiomyocyte, which is basically trapped or bound to the actin filament. So between troponin T and I, troponin I is very specific to the heart. Troponin T is also found in certain injuries of the skeletal muscle also. What is important to know is that when do you sample troponins? So I need you to take this message back home that patients with acute coronary syndrome who present in an acute period of the first 4 hours after chest pain sometimes do not have an acute rise in troponin. So which is why if you really suspect this patient to have an ongoing angina, keep this patient back in the emergency, sample his drops again after an hour, and recheck his ECGs to see new changes. You could always ensure that you pick up changes a little later. So ensure, so remember, it peaks around 4 hours and it actually stays up to 10 to 12 days, which is why troponins make a very ideal marker to pick up acute coronary syndromes. It actually tells you that this thing has actually happened, and you can actually document the rise and fall of troponins, which actually tells you that this patient had an acute coronary syndrome and is actually going through it. So now coming to our first case. So let us get into management now. So I don't think I'll be able to engage you in a conversation out here, but nevertheless, we will look at this EKG. So this is a 48-year-old male smoker who calls emergency with acute chest pain. And in ideal case scenario, a lot of ambulances nowadays have ECG, which can be transmitted to the attending cardiologist. And this is what the attending cardiologist gets on his phone. And you see these are typically known as tombstone STs, so graveyard stone STs as we call it. Of course, the reason why they are called such is because of the fatality of this disorder. And as you can see, there are small Q waves which have appeared out here with a RBB pattern, which tells you that this is likely to be a proximal LAD occlusion, and you have reciprocal changes in inferior leads, that is 2, 3 AVF with ST depressions. So remember, this is the kind of occlusion which means that this patient needs to be taken up to the cath lab almost immediately without wasting time, and he should go for a primary angioplasty. So what does a typical ECG change of a STEMI actually incorporate? So according to the definition, so as you will all know, if you're looking at leads V2 and V3, remember V2 and V3 normally has some amount of ST elevation, which is why to increase the sensitivity of picking up ECG changes, it is 2 millimeters in V2 and V3 and 1 millimeter in other contiguous leads. So when I say contiguous leads, we are talking about a territory. We are talking about, let's say if it's LAD territory, we are talking about 1 AVL V5 V6. If you're talking about mid LAD, sometimes it's between V2 to V3. Proximal LADs look at QRBB, and if there is new onset LBBB, always suspect this patients to have ACS. So next we will talk about the hyperacute changes. So sometimes these patients present really early. So when these patients present really early, this is the time when you are actually going to get tall T wave elevation, which is often not picked up initially because most of our patients, if you look at the data from the Indian registries, present to the hospital quite late. And so in this case, so if you look at, as I've shown you, we call this the exploring electrode out here. So when you have a transmural attack, so classically, that is what the description of a STEMI is. So the reason why we are talking about early revascularization is because that these kind of patients are most likely having a totally occluded artery with a transmural attack, which is why the transmurality actually first gives rise to a T wave elevation, which is known as a hyperacute T wave. Reason why these T waves are called hyperacute and why they are related to ischemia is if you were able to draw a line between this T wave, you would see that the upward slope and the downward slopes are almost equal. And similarly, out here, you see the ST segment is the next thing that goes up. The reason being that this is the part of the cardiac action myopotential, which actually has generally passive. But whenever there is an infarction, that is where all the electrical changes are there, and that is how it comes. So it is important to understand that where do you measure your STs? It is something that we often forget. So remember your STs are measured at the J point. So what is exactly J point? A J point is basically the junction. It is J stands for junction, and it's the junction between the QRS and the ST. Sometimes if you don't have an S, as you can see here, it is basically between the QR and the ST segment. So how do you measure the elevation? So remember your baseline is actually formed by the PR segment. So your PR segment to the elevated ST segment is actually what is known as the ST elevation. In most cases, this will be in small boxes, and each small box is equal to 1 millimeter. So depending on that, you will decide on how ST elevation MI is it or not. So similarly, if you were to have an ST depression, as you can see in NSTEMIs, so STEMIs is also, it is measured the same way. So you again take the PR segment as the baseline, and you look at the ST segment, which actually can be measured from the PR segment, and that gives you your idea. So you will look at, basically this is the hyperacute changes, as I told you. So T waves and then the ST segment elevation, and that is what makes a diagnosis of STEMI. So if you were to look at how this actually evolves, so if you look at the normal waves, this is the QRS followed by a normal ST segment, which is on par with the PR segment out here. Then gradually you see that there is a peaking of the T wave known as the hyperacute T wave, followed by there is a slow rise in the ST segment till it becomes the tombstone ST segment that I was showing you, and then gradually you have a Q wave formation. This is the QR pattern as you saw in this ECG, and then finally there is a T wave inversion. So this is the sequence of changes that you will see in the evolution of myocardial infarction. So how do you treat these patients? So let's say my patient was in an emergency and he has already made a call, and he's told me that he's coming to a PCI capable center. So since he's already coming to a PCI capable center, remember within 10 minutes of entering the emergency department, he gets an EKG. In this case, that is also not required because he already has an EKG and we have made a diagnosis. So he directly goes to the cath lab, and within 60 minutes it is important that we have reperfusion. So we call this the door to balloon time. So from starting to the door of the emergency till we have put a wire across, past a balloon and opened up an established flow, and that should be less than 60 minutes, that is 1 hour. Now, let's say that is not always the case in India. In India, most of these patients actually end up going to a non-PCI center. So you should spend less than 10 minutes to obtain an ECG and then decide whether this patient is about 120 minutes, in this case, that is 2 hours from a primary PCI capable center. If it is, then these patients are actually sent to a primary PCI center and they undergo PPCI. If it is greater than 2 hours, then remember fibrinolysis is the therapy of choice. Why I will discuss with you a little later. So within 10 minutes you have an ECG, and within the next 10 minutes you need to fibrinolysis, provided you are not able to transport this patient to a PCI capable center. So remember, from the CREATE registry, that is one of the largest registries from Kerala, we have been shown that the median time arrival of these patients is actually 300 minutes. So we are generally always past the 3 hours, golden hours of acute MI. And only 5% of them use ambulances. But despite that, so on reaching the hospital, what will most of these physicians, or what will I do rather, this patient once he comes to the emergency department? You ask your emergency colleagues to get good wide bore access, 18 gauge peripheral access. These patients have to be started on fluids. It's important. Most of these patients sometimes come in dehydrated to the hospital. Load them with ticagrelor. So now this is where the change is. So remember, in classical teaching, if you find, most of our textbooks teach us to load these patients with clopidogrel. So now that is where there has been a paradigm change as far as management of acute coronary syndrome. The reason why is that we finally have an antiplatelet with a mortality benefit, which was never the case with clopidogrel. So in one of the big trials, which is known as the Plateau trial, they have shown that ticagrelor against clopidogrel actually has a mortality benefit. So remember, with your eyes closed, if you have a patient of ACS, and that could be a STEMI patient, that could be an NSTEMI patient, and that could be an unstable angina patient, all of these patients should be given the benefit of ticagrelor, provided it is available in your emergency. So you load these patients with ticagrelor 180. Remember, with ticagrelor 180, we give a loading of aspirin 150 and a standard dose of atorvastatin 80 or a rosuvastatin 40, whichever one. Now, you could always ask, what happens if these patients are going to get thrombolized? Previously, about 2 years back, we did not have data of ticagrelor with thrombolysis patients, but now we have data which says that ticagrelor can actually be safely used in thrombolysis patients, but as long as the thrombolytic agent is a fibrin-specific agent, and that is what we are talking about, is tenecteplase. Remember, most of these patients do not need to be started on oxygen unless and until the SpO2 is less than 92%. And if the patient's saturation is low or 92%, please look for signs of low cardiac output. In this case, you would look for heart failure symptoms. If the patient, whether he has edema, whether he has rales, whether he has a raised JVP, or whether he has a hepatomegaly which is tender, these are things which is very, very important to be seen once the patient reaches the hospital. And of course, page cath lab for a primary PCI, and always target a door to balloon time of 90 minutes. So if we thought that it's not really happening in India, it does happen in India to a certain extent. It is better than what we were about a decade back. So if you look at the GVK EMRI services, it operates under a number 108 in a lot of states. It also operates on a number 102. And it is, remember, it runs in 15 states with 2 union territories with more than 10,000 strong fleet, and it's the largest ambulance provider in the world. So of course, coming back to our patient, so we took him up to the cath lab, and as I told you, this looks like a proximal LAD, and that is exactly what happened. So this is a proximal LAD occlusion. He was loaded with ticagrelor 90 milligrams, 2 tablets stat, as I told you, and he was taken up for a primary PCI. But what really happens in reality in India? It's unfortunate that this is not what most patients get. So this is actually probably only 10% or 15% of patients all over India who actually get the benefit of a primary angioplasty. So, which is why if you look at the CSI, that is the Cardiological Society of India position statement, they put it out very bluntly. So they tell you that if you live in a big city, the chances of you getting a primary PCI is high. But if you live in either in a small town or in a village, it is chances that you go either to the district hospital or a primary healthcare center, get a hospital-based thrombolytic therapy, and then get referred out to a bigger hospital for either rescue PCI or a pharmaco-invasive therapy, which is practical in our kind of setting. So, which is why we will talk about thrombolytic agents, as I told you. So, generally, we look at streptokinase because it is the most easily available molecule in India and it is cheap. It costs only about 3,000 rupees. It can be given as intravenously as an infusion over 30 to 60 minutes, a standard dose of 1.5 million units. And remember, with this therapy, you have a chance of having a patent artery of almost 70%. So it is important. So remember, if you don't give anything to this patient, the chances of him opening up his artery is almost zero. So even if you are able to give him this 3,000 rupee injection, the chances are that you are going to have 70% chance of opening up his artery. And if, of course, if you are able to give him a tenecteplase is going to be about 85% patency rates, and the same goes for retiplase. The beauty about tenecteplase, it's basically given as a bolus, and remember, most of these patients have to be pre-treated with heparin or Clexane, that is low molecular weight heparin. And so if you look at the standard, as I told you, most of our patients, they actually use streptokinase because that is what is most commonly available in India. And as I told you, even thrombolysis is given only to 58.5%. So which is why we are trying to tell you that even in registries like the Create, which is from a fairly from a state called Kerala, which of course has healthcare standards marginally better than the rest of the India. So even in that kind of scenario, thrombolysis was actually delivered only to about 60% of the patients. So you have to understand that 40% patients actually got nothing. The reason in most cases is because of lack of inertia from physician side and because of complications suspected from thrombolytic agents. So benefits, remember, of thrombolytic agents is best given within the first 1 hour of onset, but it has its, and remember, its effect dramatically wears off beyond 3 hours. But of course, till 12 hours, if a patient presents to you with MI, you have a chance of giving thrombolytic agents. Please do. Although the efficacy, remember, beyond 3 hours is something that is questionable, but nevertheless, it will have some amount of benefit. One small thing I would like to remind all my physician friends is that before you give this thrombolytic agent, there's a quick mental checklist you need to do. And remember, ask for GI bleeds in the last 1 month if the patient has had a CVA in the last 6 months or major surgery or trauma in the last 3 weeks. And worst is you should not miss an aortic dissection. So remember, aortic dissection is something that also presents with chest pain and it's something that can be very, very easily picked up on a clinical examination. So before you give a thrombolytic agent, I would always request all my fellow colleagues here to actually ensure that you palpate all the arterial pulses and ensure that they are present in all four limbs. And that actually kind of in a way rules out a dissection. So if you have inequality of pulses in any of the limbs, always make sure that you get a CT done to make to rule out a significant aortic dissection. Because remember, giving a thrombolytic agent in a patient with aortic dissection is nothing but fatal. So most likely, these patients is going to die. So so how do you manage these patients after PPCI or a thrombolysis? So remember, the guidelines are that these patients will require dual antiplatelet therapy mandatorily for 1 year, irrespective of what your choice is. It could be ticagrelor or with aspirin, prasugrel with aspirin, or clopidogrel with aspirin, depending on the choice. And this mostly depends on the cardiologist who's treating the patient. Remember, our current guidelines ensure that your LDL levels have to be brought down to below 50 if you've had a heart attack. That is something that is very, very important and needs to be concerned. So, we have a new target as far as lipids are concerned. You need to drive them down to 50. So, if you're using statins, ensure that you go up on your dose of statins. If despite the highest dose of statin, you're not able to achieve your LDL, please ensure that you add an ezetimibe. And of course, even if that doesn't work, you have other molecules which are far, far more expensive, like the PCSK9 inhibitors, like evolocumab. Of course, one more thing as physicians, we all need to remember is that other comorbids like hypertension, diabetes, obstructive sleep apnea, etc., has to be controlled. Your target for your A1Cs has to be less than equal to 7. We do not ask for very rigorous control of A1Cs because that has in its hypoglycemia risks. Of course, remember these patients can restart exercise regimens after 2 weeks and gradually build it up to pre-MI levels. And remember, you have to ensure that these patients get four drugs, that is your DAPT, your ACE inhibitor or ARB for remodeling, MRAs if indicated, and beta blockers, and that has to be prescribed not just in any dose but in optimum doses, and that is what we expect from most physicians. So, word about antiplatelet strategies is when in doubt, there is no contraindication from bleeding point of view in these patients. Load these patients with either clopidogrel or ticagrelor. Remember, currently, as I told you, ticagrelor can be given in a patient who has undergone thrombolysis, but preferably a fibrin-specific agent that is tenecteplase or retiplase. But of course, you should probably think twice before you're giving it in a patient with streptococcus. And of course, do not give prasugrel in ACS patients without an angiogram. So prasugrel is a drug that you will have to give on table after doing the angiogram. Why? It's because that this is a very potent drug and it cannot be reversed easily. So unless and until you are decided that this patient will need a stenting strategy and is not going to need a bypass as a form of revascularization strategy, do not give these patients prasugrel. So a small overview, I thought this would be helpful. So we have now three drugs in the armamentarium to treat ACS, and that would be clopidogrel, prasugrel, and ticagrelor. And as you look at here, so we have so of these three, what is important to know that clopidogrel and prasugrel are generally available as prodrugs, which gets activated in the liver. But ticagrelor is an active molecule, which is why it starts to work very fast. And if you crush ticagrelor and GRIF, so most of our cath labs, we crush the ticagrelor tablet and then give it to the patient. It is found to actually absorption is faster and action is within half an hour. And what is important to know is that so if you had to stop ticagrelor or clopidogrel before a standard procedure, that could be anything. That could be an elective surgery, or that could be for various bleeding. It has to be stopped for 5 days. And for prasugrel, the same thing would be 7 days, which is why we told you that prasugrel is a much more potent molecule and often not prescribed because it has generally has a higher bleeding risk. But if you were to ask me among these three molecules which has a better outcome in diabetics, of course, prasugrel has been shown to have a better outcome in diabetics. So I thought we would also touch upon certain other problems we have in as far as an MI diagnosis is concerned. So we would also one troubling point of diagnosis in patients who already have LBBB. So patients who already have a left bundle branch block, in order to make a diagnosis of MI is not easy in these patients. So often these patients are diagnosed with a criteria known as the Garbosa criteria, and the Garbosa criteria basically is based on these three parts. And if you look at it, so it basically depends on the actual axis of the QRS. I'm sorry. So if you look at here, so we are talking about concordant. So when I say concordant ST elevation, so if your general QRS is positive, your ST elevation also has to be positive. In such cases, if it is more than 1 millimeter, in this case it would be one small square, this patient gets a score of 5. So which means, so to in order to make a diagnosis as per the Garbosa criteria, you need to have a score which is greater than 3. The problem comes when you have discordant ST elevation. So when you have discordant means your QRS vector, the overall QRS vector is negative, but your ST elevation is on the opposite hand positive. So in these cases, it has to be more than 5 millimeters, which means 5 small squares. But when it comes to the V2, V3 leads, we would look at probably the ST depression, and in this case, that will be 1 millimeter ST depression. So the idea is that in a patient where you're not well, who already had an LBVB, you're going to look at the concordant ST elevation of greater than 1 millimeter or a discordant ST elevation of greater than 5 millimeter. But only when it comes to V2, V1 to V3, and those patients you are going to look at ST depression. And this in these cases, you're basically, as I told you, so the concordant ST elevation has a score of 5, concordant ST depression has a score of 3, and excessively discordant ST elevation has a score of 2. So remember, just an excessively ST elevation of greater than 5 is not always going to give you a diagnosis of MI in a patient with LBVB. So you will need with that another concordant ST depression also, either in V1 to V3 or a concordant ST elevation. So let's look at some ECGs. So here, as you can see, so this is a patient who has a general LBVB. As you can see, it is an incomplete LBVB. Mostly has a left axis. And if you look at the AVL, so if you look at, as I told you, how to make a diagnosis of ST elevation, you look at the PR segment out here. So if you draw a line from the PR, the ST elevation is about 1 millimeter. And as I told you, according to the Garbosa criteria, that is 5 points. So it calls for diagnosis of an MI in a patient with LBBB. So what else can you see in this patient which makes a diagnosis of LBBB? So you look quickly. So if you look at, so you will see the V5, V6, you have deep ST depressions out here, as well as lead 1 is predominantly negative. So this also tells you, so you have a QS kind of complex in lead 1, and these ST depressions basically suggest of a high lateral MI in the presence of LBBB. Now, similarly, this is a paced rhythm. So remember, a paced rhythm is nothing but an induced LBVB. So here, iatrogenically, we keep a lead in the RV. So a pacemaker rhythm is generally has an LBVB. And here, as I told you, in V2, V3, we look mostly at ST depressions. But important thing out here to note is that you will see that these ST depressions are also seen in 2, 3, as well as AVF. So it tells you that this is mostly an inferior wall MI with a posterior wall involvement. So remember the leads V2, V3 look at the posterior wall of the heart. So actually, if you were able to invert this ECG, you would see ST elevation in V2, V3. And that is what is the clinching diagnosis of a posterior MI. So remember, a posterior MI never really happens on its own. It is always associated with an inferior wall MI. Similarly, let's look at here. So this is another, and as I told you in V2, V3, you're going to first, if you were to make a diagnosis in a paced rhythm, so you see there's some amount of ST depression out here followed by an elevation. So that again tells you that this is a patient with Carbosa's criteria and it fulfills criteria, and you make a diagnosis of MI. Now coming to NSTEMI ACS management strategy, remember as I told you the diagnosis of an NSTEMI or an unstable angina is basically those patients who have chest pain, and if you have a biomarker, cardiac biomarker positive, it basically, and with ECG criteria not fitting that of a STEMI, these patients would actually become a part of NSTEMI. The same part in certain patients who have ECG changes as well as chest pain, but need not always necessarily have a biomarker positive, and the chest pain happens at rest with an increasing frequency and severity forms the group of patients who have unstable angina. So in all of these patients, thankfully, the treatment strategy is more or less uniform. So we are going to load these patients with antiplatelets. In your case, it could be clopidogrel, ticagrelor, or prasugrel. But as I told you, prasugrel we do not load unless and until we have an angiogram. Whereas you can use ticagrelor, as I told you, is now a class 1 recommendation because it is an antiplatelet with a mortality benefit. Then, of course, these patients also need to have an anticoagulation on board. So remember the atherothrombosis cascade has two parts to it. So there is a platelet part to it, and there is also anticoagulation part to it, and both of these need to be addressed. So you need to have antiplatelets on board as well as you need to have anticoagulants in the form of either LMWH, that is Clexane, or unfractionated heparin, or pentasaccharides like fondaparinux. Of course, ensure that these patients have optimized blood pressures, sugars, and hydration status, monitor ECGs and cardiac biomarkers, and plan for an early revascularization that is within 24 hours of admission. Unlike STEMI, where you have a 3-hour golden hour rule, and we have these patients, moreover, needs to be actually managed with medicines first, and within 24 hours need to get an angiogram and revascularization if required. Of course, there is no role of thrombolytics except left main occlusion. So I will come to an ECG where I will show you left main occlusion. So left main occlusion, unstable angina, or NSTEMI has some role for a thrombolytic. Treat for heart failure and rhythm abnormalities. And remember, early initiation of ACE inhibitors, ARBs, beta blockers, and MRAs as and when indicated actually benefits and improves mortality in these kind of patients. So some quick ECG patterns that I would really want you to look out for in patients with chest pain. So this is something known as a biphasic T wave, which is basically seen in V1 to V4, and this is classically defined as the Wellens pattern. So remember, these kind of patients actually come with a proximal LAD occlusion, as you can see here with the white arrow. So you see that the whole LAD was occluded, and it basically is seen here as the biphasic pattern in V1 to V4. And this is also sometimes known as Winter's pattern, Winter's T pattern, or Wellens LAD T pattern. And so this is something that is often very easily picked up on a standard ECG of a patient who's coming to you in the OPD. So it is something that you need to watch out for. And these are patients, if they are quickly referred to a cardiologist, they need to go an urgent angiogram and think they should do well with a good PTCA. So remember this. There is actually for physicians, or rather, when I was doing my medicine, I always used to read a lot about etymology of murmurs. So remember this kind of proximal LAD, tight proximal LADs, they also cause a high-pitched diastolic murmur that is often picked up. Why? Because it's mostly happens during coronaries fill, mostly during diastole, not in systole. And it often mimics that of an AV fistula, which is a atriovascular connection between an artery and a vein, and this is known as Dock's murmur. So it is something that I thought it would be interesting for you to remember also. So you can sometimes pick up a proximal LAD tight stenosis by actually an early decrescendo diastolic murmur, and this is known as Dock's murmur. So remember, this is again another. So I told you excruciating chest pain radiating to the jaw is something that is generally suggestive of left main or proximal LAD occlusion. So if you look at this, this looks like a very innocuous ECG at the beginning, but if you look at very carefully, you will find that there is an ST elevation in AVR, along with there is ST depressions, which you can see in 1, you can see in AVL, as well as you can see in V4, V5, V6. These are basically leads which look into the cavity of the heart and basically suggestive of left main occlusion. So this is a very dangerous type of ECG. If you do happen to pick this up, have this patient referred to a cardiac center at the earliest. So this patient had an angiogram, and as you can see, so there is a tight left main occlusion out here. So this is the LAD, and this is the circumflex. So that is the tight occlusion. So let's look at this one more ECG out here. So this is a patient who's presented to the ED, 42-year-old male with epigastric discomfort, 2 episodes of syncope and fall. I'm sure you would appreciate that there is this tall ST elevations in 2, 3 AVF, as well as the reciprocal changes which are seen in 1 AVL, V5, V6, which is suggestive of a large inferior wall MI. If you were to be asked whether it's from an LCX or an RCA territory, remember if your ST segment is more in 3 than in 2, remember this is most likely to be an RCA territory MI. So, and moreover, what I need you to look at is these P's running through the QRSS. So remember, your QRSS is coming at a regular rate, but you can see there is no relationship with the P's. So this is known as complete heart block. So this is typically a presentation of inferior wall MI, large dominant RCAs which present with complete heart block, and this is one of the causes of reversible heart block. So if these patients were to be taken up for an angioplasty and their RCA is opened up, generally within the next few days, the complete heart block resolves. So this is something that needs to be picked up. So how do you know this is complete heart block? Because you see more P's than QRSs, and you see that the P's are actually marching through the QRSs, and there is no relationship between the P and the QRS. So let's look at something more interesting. So if again I were to show you this ECG, this is again not necessarily all patients of chest pain present with an acute MI. So if I were to give you some history for this ECG, let's look at it this way. So there was a 30-year-old lady on oral contraceptives who presents with an acute chest pain and shortness of breath. So what do we see in this ECG if you look at from a very broad aspect? So you can see that there is some amount of tachycardia. So there's sinus tachycardia in this patient. You can see there is an RBB-like pattern. So you have a QR pattern in V1, RSR dash in V2, and you have prominent S waves in V6, suggestive of an RBB pattern. And moreover, you will get something that is very classical, although this is a very classical ECG and not necessarily you will find this every time. So let's point this out. So this, as I told you, was the QRBB pattern. And so this is known as the S wave in lead 1. And you see there is a Q3, Q wave in lead 3, and an inverted T wave in lead 3. So this is known as an S1, Q3, T3 pattern, which is very suggestive of pulmonary embolism. So patients of this is very commonly seen. Ladies on OCPs often have DVTs and they throw this embolus into the lungs and they present with acute chest pain. So in these kind of patients, remember the treatment is generally anticoagulation provided they are stable. But if they are hemodynamically unstable, remember again that is an indication for thrombolysis. But generally, this kind of thrombolysis is a catheter-based thrombolysis into the pulmonary artery. So that is something that needs to be remembered. So again, something very important. So 18-year-old boy with high-grade fever, sore throat, and joint pains in the past 1 week now presents with chest pain. So of course, as physicians, we would not always suspect this patient to have an acute MI. 18 years generally don't have acute coronary artery disease, although it is nowadays not uncommon. We've had patients even in 17 years, 18 years coming with acute MI. But this is very strange part of this patient is again if you look, there is a borderline tachycardia in this patient. He's averaging about 100. And if you look at, there is global SGT changes. So if what do I mean by global? So if you look at contiguous territories, as I told you, so 1 AVL V3 to V6, this is mostly the LAD territory, and you can see there is ST elevation out here. Similarly, if you were to look at the inferior territories, which is represented by 2, 3 AVF, even in these patients, you can see there's some amount of ST elevation. But remember, here the concavity is upwards and not convexity upwards. So in classical MI, if you go back, so there is basically a convexity upwards, but here there is a concavity upwards ST elevation. And what is more important is if I would have able to actually magnify that last lead 2 strip, you will see that there is a PR depression. So as I told you, it's a concavity upwards and there is a PR segment which is depressed. So a PR segment depression is a very classical sign of pericarditis. So these are patients with pericarditis after a viral myocarditis most likely, and these patients actually do very well with good doses of aspirin. Sometimes they do need a dose of steroids to reduce the pain, but remember these are the patients who should not be given heparin because once you give heparin to these patients, they sometimes develop a pericardial effusion. So let's look at one more here. So this is again another patient, as you can see, very weird complexes. As you can see, there is some amount of ST elevation, and the ST is again concavity upwards. Some places you can see that the J point is raised. And so this was a 49-year-old postmenopausal woman who presents with to the ED after a heated argument with her son, and she's anxious and hyperventilating. You get a trop done, and the tropi is 6. Patient is taken up for an angiogram because the ECG is very suggestive of an MI, and you find that the angiogram is completely normal. So this patient, when we did a ventriculogram, this is what is known as a Takotsubo syndrome. So Takotsubo syndrome, as you can see out here, is something that basically there is apical ballooning of the heart in a systole, where you can see there is contraction of the basal part and there is apical ballooning, and this basically represents or symbolizes the Japanese octopus trap, and that is why it's called the Takotsubo syndrome. In today's literature, we nowadays call these patients as MINOCA, that is MI with non-obstructive coronary arteries. So patients who have an angiogram which is normal, but you have a cardiac biomarker which is high, which tells you that there was some amount of injury to the myocardium. And in these kind of patients is mostly because of the catecholamine surge. So the catecholamine surge causes coronary spasm, and that coronary spasm gives rise to transient ischemia. which is why the Mayo Clinic criteria for a diagnosis of Takotsubo syndrome emphasizes on the fact that the hypokinesia that is seen on echocardiogram is generally transient and it goes away. So, in order to make a diagnosis, these LVs generally should come back to normal, but in many cases they don't and they develop scars. So in certain patients where the spasm is there for a prolonged time, there's actually ischemia and there's cardiomyocyte injury and death. One of the last ECGs that I will show you is that of this is something that is very, very alarming. So 65-year-old smoker presents with recurrent syncope, head injury, seizure-like attacks, and had complained of chest pain prior to the episode. He's rushed into the emergency. He's hypotensive. You basically intubate this patient and you get your first ECG, and this is what you see. So this is basically ventricular tachycardia, and this patient needs to be cardioverted at the earliest. Remember, hemodynamically unstable patients with ventricular tachycardia, you do not need to look around anywhere. Just go ahead and cardiovert these patients. So finally, we will touch about little about the mechanical complications of MI that is quite commonly seen in patients in our country because of late presentations. So there are three major late complications of an MI. We are talking about ventricular septal rupture, papillary muscle rupture, and free wall rupture, of which the most fatal is free wall rupture. Patients generally do not survive. Papillary muscle ruptures basically present with acute myocardial mitral regurgitation, and these patients go into failure, frank pulmonary edema, require intubation, and need early surgery. Ventricular septal rupture again is a subset which has a very high mortality. And of course, these patients, remember, most of these complications happen around a week from the acute chest pain. So patients who present to your OPD with acute chest pain and after about 1 week since the chest pain and haven't got any treatment, remember always to auscultate these patients because these patients are have a high risk of developing heart failure as well as complications of MI that could be ventricular septal rupture, papillary muscle rupture, or free wall rupture. So, quick take homes from this talk. So, early diagnosis in STEMI will save lives. It is important that the diagnosis is made early. It is important that TROP-T, remember, comes positive only after 4 hours. So, often we do a TROP-T card test and it comes back and negative. But if your index of suspicion in these patients are high, do ask these patients to stay back. Cycle your TROPs and ECGs every 1 or 2 hours, and then once you get a positive result, you know that these patients will need to be triaged according to the acute coronary syndrome pathway. Load most of these patients with DAP should be done when the index of suspicion is high and bleeding risk is low, especially in our kind of setting where always patients do not have the reach or do not have access to first-hand medical care or to an ECG or an echo. So these patients, if you really suspect that this patient is having a very classical angina and you think that the patient and has an ECG which is suggestive of MI, please ensure that this patient gets the standard loading dose of clopidogrel 300 with aspirin 325 and an atorvastatin 80. Also, good history and a thorough physical exam is always a must. And remember, you'll always pick up STEMI mimicas, as I told you. So, quick things to remember, things which are fatal and can be treated is aortic dissection and pulmonary embolism. These also present with chest pain and is something that can only be ruled out with a good history and clinical examination. Of course, look at peripheral pulses before thrombolysis. As I told you, it always helps you to rule out dissections. Aggressive risk factor modification post MI with optimal guideline directed medical therapy is something that has to be emphasized to all these patients with an acute coronary syndrome. So I will quickly end my talk with this small this thing, and this is as I told you, this is sorry, forgive me. So this is the Choluteca Bridge in Honduras. So it's a small story. I hope I won't bore you. So the Choluteca Bridge in Honduras was built by the Japanese and it cost crores of rupees, and it was a very good bridge and very strong. And as you can see, it was all going well till Hurricane Mitch hit Honduras in 2000 in 1998. So once Hurricane Mitch hit, it damaged almost most of the approach roads to the bridge, And what was left of the bridge after Hurricane Mitch left was that the river Choluteca actually changed its course, and it was no more running below the bridge, but rather it was running away from the bridge. And it had completely changed, and there was no point in having the bridge. So sometimes what we need to remember that the problem needs to be innovative. You need to look at the problem from a broad aspect and not always from the parochial ideas or views of a cardiologist. So remember, chest pain does not always necessarily have to be an MI. It is something that could be a pulmonary embolism, it could be a pericarditis, it could be an aortic dissection, it could be Takotsubo, it could be so many other things which need to be ruled out. And remember, most of these things are treatable, and they are treatable only if you diagnose them well. Thank you so much. Hello.
Thank you, Dr. Oyan. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Oyan. If the audience, you have any question, please just put it in the chat box so that the Oyan can discuss, Dr. Oyan can discuss on those issues. I think that there should be enough questions actually after this lecture. And thank you, Dr. Han, for your excellent lecture.
Thank you,
And
sir.
unless there is any questions, I have some questions that I will ask later. That
Okay,
what we have.
there are some questions. Should I read them
Yeah,
out?
yeah, please.
So, Dr. Ahmed Ali Bafadel says that so he's asked what is the pathophysiology of myocardial injury in case of kidney disease, and other than uremic pericarditis and myocarditis. So, of course, most of these patients remember the very fact that the uremic milieu itself causes myocarditis. There is a lot of hypoxia because these patients are generally also have some amount of iron deficiency anemia. They have metabolic acidosis, as well as they have the basic idea of uremia itself causes a very distinct form of cardiomyopathy known as uremic cardiomyopathy. So the myocardial injury in this case could be a combination of coronary artery disease, which is not uncommon in kidney patients, along with anemia as well as acidosis. So that is generally the cause of myocardial injury in these kind of patients, which is why you will see they always have a stable amount of troponin I in their bloods whenever you measure troponin I. And I think after that, Nobindu has raised a question, and he says role of IV beta blockers in emergency. Well, generally beta blockers. Remember, to put it in a nutshell, Nobindu, when a patient has an acute MI, your autonomic nervous system is in a fight and flight mode. So at that point of time, generally we do not give beta blockers in an acute setting. The reason being that it takes away the compensatory response of the body. But of course, certain patients who have refractory VT. So VT storms are the patients who may actually benefit from IV beta blockers. Otherwise, there is generally no role of IV beta blockers in acute coronary syndrome management. Then Amar has asked, what are the clinical manifestations of reperfusion injury and how frequently you encounter them? So, reperfusion injury is very common, and in fact, it is something that we are happy to see. You would always see that in once we open up an occluded vessel because of the acute effects of opening up a vessel and all, and there is reactive oxygen species that are generated, it causes some amount of reperfusion injury, and that is often seen in the form of VT. Slow VT is one of the causes of one of the ways we look at reperfusion injury, and we are generally happy to see them. It tells us that we've done an adequate job as far as opening up the artery is concerned, and it is quite commonly seen. It tells you that you've done a good job. And then Ashwin has asked ideal time to start anticoagulation after thrombolysis. Yes, it is immediately. So if you're using a standard dose of tenecteplase, let's say, so we generally break up the dose of a 60 clicks in. We give half before and half after. And after that, I think it is at 12, 24, and 36 hours as far as anticoagulation is concerned. Ahmed, have already discussed this one. Kali Kinkor has asked ticagrelor and thrombolysis relations. When to avoid ticagrelor? Maybe repeat it, please. So ticagrelor and thrombolysis, the data that we have, it is from a trial known as the TREAT trial. The TREAT trial was basically seen in those patients who got tenecteplase. As you know, these are mostly Caucasian trials and Western data, so they do not really use streptokinase, which is why we have no data to say that ticagrelor can be safely used in streptokinase. But we would say that if you're using a fibrin specific agent, which includes retiplase, alteplase, as well as tenecteplase, you could safely use ticagrelor as your standard therapy of choice as far as antiplatelet is concerned. How can you know the time of myocardial injury from ECG? So that is something that I've already discussed. So depending on whether you are in the stage of hyperacute T wave, that is one of the earliest manifestations, then followed by the ST segment elevation. And so generally the course is somewhere between minutes to hours, and this generally evolves over a few hours. And so generally beyond 3 to 6 hours, as we say, we mostly miss the bus. So beyond that, most of the therapies of revascularization has a limited role, but nevertheless, it is not zero. So then again, somebody has if it can give lytic therapy after starting anticoagulant agent. The lytic therapy available later. I'm not sure what that means. Is can give lytic therapy after starting anticoagulant agent. Lytic therapy available later. So if you give anticoagulation, so lytic therapy is always given in conjunction with anticoagulation. So we never give thrombolysis without Clexane or heparin on board. So it always happens together. So Dr. Vikas asks why use of ticagrelor is superior to clopidogrel as loading dose. Just missed the point. Acha. So Dr. Vikas, the thing is this that we have a trial known as the Plateau trial. It basically compares ticagrelor versus clopidogrel, and it basically tells you that ticagrelor is the only molecule till date which we have found to be safe. Now, if you ask me how is it safe compared to clopidogrel, it is because it was found to have a better bleeding safety as far as clopidogrel was concerned. So, efficacy-wise, it was found to be non-inferior to clopidogrel, but since it has a better bleeding profile compared to clopidogrel and has a much more predictable pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, which is why it is a much better drug as far as clopidogrel is concerned. And moreover, it is something, it is reversible, it has a short half-life, it can be stopped quickly, and its effect wears down also quickly, which is why it is an ideal antiplatelet. Daniel Agbo, he okay. So Puneet Jain asks why CKD patient has a raised drop eye. So reason being that mostly these patients have some amount of chronic angina, myocardial injury because of associated anemia as well as the metabolic milieu. And there is also, you can say that tropa is basically a molecule which is generally excreted by the kidney. So when these patients are completely dialysis dependent, these patients tend to accumulate tropi, which is why they are generally chronic trops are positive. I think we've answered all the questions. No, Amar Singh, sir, any indications of IV platelet and when to give them? So Amar, so we have only one IV antiplatelet available in the market, and that is known as Cangrelor. It is used in certain countries, but the reason being we don't use them here, it's because it's expensive and it has a very short half-life, and it acts almost exactly like ticagrelor, and it is the intravenous form of it. But generally, nobody uses intravenous antiplatelet therapy. The only reason where you might want to give it is when your oral absorption is something that you are suspecting, which means that say a patient is having constant vomiting or has for whatever reasons whatever drug you have given has not reached the gut. In those kind of patients you might think of giving an IV antiplatelet. And Ashwin asks how to manage a patient with post thrombolysis with persistent chest pain in non PCI capable center. Role of any drug therapy like tirofiban, nitroglycerin infusion. So that is a very good question, Ashwin. So, if you want to know what is the criteria for failed thrombolysis, it is basically less than 50% reduction in the ST segment elevation is with ongoing angina is the definition for a failed thrombolysis. So, these kind of patients need to be taken up for a rescue PCI. But of course, if rescue PCI is not there, there's not much you can do. You can continue your anticoagulation, ensure your antiplatelet is on board, and you need to ensure that the patient gets maximum amount of anti-anginals that they can get. That could be nitroglycerin, that could be ranolazine, that could be your trimetazidine, as well as nicorandil. So any one of them as you can give, but remember that is nothing compared to a rescue PCI. So these patients definitely need to go for rescue PCI. So what does Dr. Vikas also asks about few words of what precautions we should take in OT for a high risk patient. So patients who are at high risk for okay, so this is something that you have to prevent, Vikas. So Vikas, if a patient comes into the OT and you suspect that this patient has a high risk for an acute coronary syndrome, these patients need to be worked up by the cardiologist. They need to undergo a preemptive angiogram to risk stratify, unfortunately. But apart from that, if this patient develops an acute coronary syndrome on table during an elective procedure, well, it is a difficult situation. The reason being that you are in the middle of an elective surgery, and most of the therapy for acute coronary syndrome involves antiplatelets or anticoagulation, which is going to increase your bleeding risk as far as the surgery is concerned. So, in most of these cases, what we would do is we would ask the surgeon to quickly close to ensure hemostasis and get this patient quickly to a cath lab for a primary PCI. And of course, that is after explaining the bleeding risk to the patient and the patient's relatives. So Nobindu also asked, should thrombolysis be followed by an angiogram if feasible, even if patient has shown signs of reperfusion? Very good question. So Nobindu, the answer to your question is that in most of our patients who undergo thrombolysis, they undergo an angiogram to look at coronary anatomy to rule out other residual lesions apart from the infarct related artery. It is not standard practice. So what you could ask is that if a patient has undergone thrombolysis and if the thrombolysis is successful, is there any need for going in for a repeat angiogram? So the idea is this, that till date we have certain data. So this is what you are saying is known as the pharmacoinvasive approach. So the pharmacoinvasive approach basically is found to have no benefit till date. So, but nevertheless, it is generally followed in our part of the world because we would like to risk prognosticate these patients to ensure that they do not have other very significant lesions in other coronary arteries, which could cause a heart attack later on. So Ashwin also asked, role of thrombolysis with late presentation more than 12 hours with active chest pain. Well, there is no role of thrombolysis in a patient who's presenting to you beyond 12 hours. As you know, as I told you, the efficacy of thrombolysis is almost zero beyond 12 hours. So in these kind of patients, if they are still having ongoing chest pain and if they can be sent to a PCI capable center, send them to a PCI capable center or treat them like an unstable angina. That means load them with antiplatelets, give them their anticoagulation, and ensure that they have adequate anti-anginals on board.
Thank you, Dr. Arun. And just a last question I am asking, do you want to, I just want to ask something about the resistance in actually ischemic heart is sometimes aspirin resistant or sometimes clopidogrel resistant, because sometimes earlier this type of question used to come.
Sir, so
So
we have done two studies on antiplatelet resistance from our own center, and it has been published before also. So
yeah,
aspirin resistance is generally something that is never seen. But of course, clopidogrel, because of its abnormal pharmacokinetics and dynamics, and because of its processing in the liver, has a pharmacogenomic profile which is not common. So we have seen that clopidogrel resistance sometimes is present in 10 to 30% of patients. But remember, here the clopidogrel resistance is something that is measured on a laboratory test. But it is not necessary that all these patients who are resistant to clopidogrel that they have recurrent acute coronary syndrome. So it does not necessarily translate into clinical events. So as far as we have seen in our kind of studies in India, most of our patients who get clopidogrel, the amount of platelet suppression is something that is not uniform, but it does not necessarily result into clinical events. So, which is why I think clopidogrel is still very safe and it can be given to our patients without any problem.
okay. Okay, then thank you, Dr. Arun. And at the outset, I must thank ACB Forum for giving us this platform without any conflict of interest for regularly arranging as well as giving this time, spending this time without any financial reason. So with this, I will thank you all, the audience, as well as Dr. Oyan for having this session and spending some time with Oyan, particularly from his busy schedule to spend this time. And I will request Dr. Oyan, I think there is another interesting and you are also expert on that particular subject, that is the heart failure or cardiac, because Dr. Oyan is also, you are running the heart transplant unit. Sorry, not unit, he had a part of the heart transplant unit, a team in the NH Arentegur Hospital. So I think if you can actually take that class, particularly the cardiac failure.
Okay, sir.
So I think that we can keep, because this is another interesting topic.
Sure, sir.
And its management, what are the management perspective, and so with this, I will thanks all for the participation, and thanks ISV Forum, Bijita, you, Jayati.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oyan.
Acha, your next class will be on Monday, and that Dr. Devaboto will take that, continue that ECG class. I think that may be the last class, I think. And in
Okay.
the initial part, 30 minutes, there will be question answer. So whatever questions related to the tachyarrhythmia, bradyarrhythmia, that you can also ask. And if there is any doubt about the electrophysiological aspect, you can ask that question or discuss in that particular Monday. Okay. With this, I will thanks all for your participation.
Thank you, sir.